So welcome everybody to the second last webinar of the Manitoba Important Bird Areas program, a spring webinar series. My name is Amanda and I'm the coordinator of the Manitoba IBA program. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that we are joining this webinar from across the province of Manitoba in the territories of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Dakota, Dene, and Oji Cree nations and the homeland of the Métis Nation. The Nature Manitoba office sits in Treaty 1 territory and the traditional and the homeland of the Métis Nation. All of these people have been caretakers of the land since time immemorial and continue to be strong caretakers today and into the future. So today we're going to highlight some of the bird species in Manitoba that are nocturnal or active at night and crepuscular, active at dawn or at dusk. Most of us are generally on the lookout for birds during the daytime. So birds that take advantage of the nighttime hours are less known by some. So we're going to be going over some of the different species you may see or hear at dusk and dawn and overnight, as well as some of the adaptations that help them to be successful during those time periods. So without further ado, we will get started here. So I just did a brief explanation of this, but generally in terms of wildlife, we divide up the 24-hour period into species that are diurnal or active during the day, species that are nocturnal or active at night, and species that are crepuscular, active at dawn and dusk. So a species doesn't have to fall into just one of these categories. They can be active in more than one category, but generally we categorize them according to the time of day or night where they are most active. So today I'm primarily going to talk about the nocturnal and crepuscular bird species in Manitoba, but you will see sometimes it'll come up that they'll be diurnal and crepuscular or nocturnal and crepuscular. In terms of where you can see some of these birds, I am going to be talking about where you can see them inside Manitoba's important bird areas. You will have seen a similar slide to this if you were in last week's webinar. Basically, Manitoba's important bird areas were nominated and chosen mostly in 1999. And important bird areas are areas identified because they hold either large congregations of birds that are either breeding or on migration, or they have importance to bird species at risk. And some of the ones I'm going to talk about today, for some of them, part of the reason that they were designated is that they were important habitat for nocturnal or crepuscular species, and others of them were designated originally for other species, but also are important habitat for our nocturnal and crepuscular species. So the first group may be a group that you were not necessarily expecting for our nocturnal species, but that would be the herons, and not all of our herons are nocturnal. I'm going to be talking about one specific species. But when you think of herons, you may sort of automatically go to the great blue heron, who's on the lower left picture, or the American bittern, who's in the lower right picture. And these heron species are generally feeding during the day as well as at dusk and dawn. But there is another heron in Manitoba called the black-crowned night heron. And like the name suggests, this is the heron that's really more adapted for life at night. So in terms of how you would go about identifying the black-crowned night heron, its name is a good indicator. It does indeed have a black crown of feathers, as well as having a black back. And then the rest of the body, including the wings and the breast, is light gray. It generally has its neck tucked in, which gives it a different silhouette than, say, the great blue heron, but it can extend its neck and have a longer silhouette, which is what the juvenile is doing down below. So you can see the juvenile has quite a different color pattern. It looks quite similar to the American bittern, so sometimes it gets mistaken for that. This is a nocturnal species that you can see during the day. Sometimes, often you'll see it hunkered down and roosting during the day, usually tucked into some cattail or some taller grass. But if you are listening for the call, either during the day or the night, I'll play it now, and hopefully this sound comes through to you guys. So it's kind of a barking squawk. In terms of adaptations, why might the black-crowned night heron be active and foraging at night instead of during the day? So a lot of herons are actually colonial nesters, both with members of their own species, but also with other herons. And this means that there can be a lot of competition for food. So a way that black-crowned night herons have adapted to be better at that competition for food, or to lessen that competition for food, is that they're feeding between evening and early morning. That way they avoid competing with those other herons for particularly good spots that might have more prey or that kind of thing. So all of the heron species are eating similar things. They're eating aquatic insects, they're eating amphibians, small mammals, small fish. So being able to feed at a different time can give the black-crowned night herons an advantage compared to other herons who are all trying to feed at the same time. If you were to go to look for a black-crowned night heron, there's no specific spot I could give you to say that you'd definitely be able to go out and see them. They are generally distributed in the prairie pothole region of Manitoba. So I have a map here with our important bird areas outlined in orange. And I have little pins on ones where black-crowned night herons occur. So areas like Netley-Leebow Marsh, Okamic Marsh would probably be your closest spot to Winnipeg, the northeast and west Shoal Lakes IBA, Delta Marsh, Proven Lake, which is just south of Riding Mountain National Park, and in southwestern Manitoba, Oak Lake and Whitewater Lake. You can be looking for colonial nesting sites in trees or shrubs. And as I mentioned, during the day when the black-crowned night heron is hunkered down to roost, you can look for them in beds of cattail or Phragmites grass. Our next group that we are going to look at is possibly another unexpected group. And these are the rails. So I have the Sora rail and the Virginia rail, which are the top and bottom pictures respectively on here, just to kind of give you an idea of the look and the body shape of rails. So they are small to medium-sized birds. They spend most of the time on the ground associated with wetlands. They kind of have a chicken shape if you're going to classify them sort of with a well-known sort of bird species in your head. However, they have long toes that help them to walk across floating vegetation, which you can see on the Sora rail on the top. And they also have compressed bodies that allow them to move easily through thick vegetation. So looking at them from the side on, all looks pretty normal. If you were to look at them head on, they're laterally compressed, so they'd look quite skinny. So the rail that we are going to talk about in particular is the yellow rail. So like I mentioned, their bodies are they're laterally compressed and their feet are adapted to be able to walk through marshy areas. And I put sights and sounds in here, but you're probably very rarely going to see them if you ever would, because they are so secretive and they live in really dense marshy habitats. So you are far, far more likely to be hearing the yellow rail. If you were to see it, they would be buffy below and dark above, with yellowish stripes alternating with dark on the back. And they have a short tail, a short neck, and a short beak. if you do go out and try to hear the yellow rail, it does have a really unique song, which sounds like two pebbles rhythmically clacking together. So I'll play the sound for you here. There'll be another bird calling in the background, but listen for the pebble clacking noise. So without knowing, if you came across that sound, I don't think, at least for me, the fact that a bird is making that would not be my first guess or the first thing that would come to mind. So in terms of what adaptations yellow rails have for to forage at night, we actually don't really know. In captivity, yellow rails forage during the day and sleep during the night when they're not calling. But little is known about the behavior of wild yellow rails because they are so secretive. The related Sora and Virginia rails that I had the pictures of on the first rail slide are most active at dawn and dusk, but they're also active during the day. So the yellow rail's nighttime calling is a bit of a mystery. If you were to go and try to hear yellow rails, the two spots in sort of southern and central Manitoba to go are the Douglas Marsh IBA, which is in the top map picture, and it's just east of Brandon. And the other place that you can try would be Proven Lake, which I mentioned earlier, which is just south of Riding Mountain National Park. And their habitat is going to be marshy areas and particularly sedge meadows within marshes. So sedges look a lot like grasses, but if you were to look closely and to pick one up and roll it between your fingers, it is a triangular shape rather than flat like grass. So these two pictures here, you can see the habitat. It's marshy, but then there's also sort of higher sedge meadows that are needed. That way nests aren't occurring in really wet areas. In terms of timing, listening starting at dusk or near dawn can be good times to try and hear the yellow rail. So next we are going to move on to a group of species that you probably expected in a Nocturnal Birds webinar. We're going to spend some time on owls. We're certainly not going to go super in depth or cover all of the owls, but we're going to try to focus on those that are primarily nocturnal and or crepuscular. So contrary to the saying night owl, not all owls are nocturnal. They can be active during the day, during the night, or crepuscular, and a mixture of the three. When they're active largely depends on when their prey is active. And in terms of why they are active at night, hunting at night can help owls stay hidden from predators, from their own predators, as well as it helps the owls stay hidden from their prey. So we're going to do the adaptations first this time. That way you can sort of have a think about these adaptations as we go through our different owl species. So owls have a highly developed sense of sight, probably not surprising because they are hunting at night. They have really large eyes, which helps with their night vision. The eyes of owls are anywhere from 1 to 5% of their body weight. And due to the size and weight of the eyes are actually fixed in their head by a structure called sclerotic rings. So this means that owls are not able to keep their head in one position and move their eyeballs up, down, left, or right. Their eyes are fixed. And instead, they have to move their whole head, which is where you get that really far swivel, 270 degrees. And they have twice as many neck vertebrae as people in order to be able to do this. They also have more rod than cone cells on the retina. So people have rod and cone cells too, and rod cells are sensitive to light and movement, and cone cells are usually for color. So owls having more rod cells helps them obviously see things in low light and are better able to detect movement. When you compare their number of rod cells to what people have, an owl will have approximately 1 million rod cells per square millimeter, and a human will have about 200,000. So they have much more than us. However, due to their limited cone cells, owls often see either in limited color or monochrome. And you may have heard that nocturnal owls have dark eyes, diurnal owls have yellow eyes, and crepuscular owls have orange eyes. This is not necessarily true. Owls active at different times of day and night have a variety of colored eyes, which you'll see once we get into our different species. There was a study of 200 owl species completed in 2018, and they did not find any significant evidence that owl eye color was connected to the time of day or night that the owls were active. So as far as I know, we're not sure why owls have different colored eyes. So next, we're going to talk about sound. So although it doesn't look like it on their feathered heads like other birds, owls do have ears on either side. They're just covered up by their feathers. And like other animals, the ears on the left and right allow them to pinpoint sounds from either side. And you can see an owl ear on the top image here. But owls also can have ear asymmetry, which means that one ear will be higher on the head than the other ear. And this allows them to pinpoint sounds from above and below as well. So this means between the two, sounds can be pinpointed in 3D space and not just from one side or the other of the head. Additionally, you'll notice on the picture on the bottom, as well as once we start going through the species, many owls will have feathers arranged in a facial disc, and you can see the facial disc of the owl on the bottom, the sort of white or light colored area in kind of a heart shape. And this facial disc and the feathers on the face help funnel sound to the ears, which increases their hearing ability as well. Owls can also have an operculum, which is a flap of skin in the ear that shields the ear from loud sounds. And the last one we're going to talk about is the owl's quiet flight. You've probably heard that owls are very silent flyers, and the leading edge of the owl's wing will have feathers that are adapted to have a comb-like fringe, which you can see on the sort of zoomed in image across the bottom here. So that'll be on the front part of the wing, closer to the owl's head. Whereas if you looked close up at the feathers on the trailing edge of the wing, the back edge of the wing, they would have a soft hair-like fringe. And these two fringes work together to break down the turbulence caused by the wing into microturbulence, which results in quiet flight. So if you've ever heard a bird fly close to you, kind of low, especially larger birds like geese or ducks, you may hear a whump from the wings, or sometimes you'll hear a whistling sound of the wings through the air, and you wouldn't hear either of those with owl flight. So now we're going to get into our species specific. So the first one we're going to talk about is the long-eared owl. Probably the most noticeable part of the long-eared owl are its long ears. I'll put in quotation marks. So what we might consider ears sticking up from the top of the head are not ears. Those are in fact feathers. The ears would be down on the sides of the head, kind of equal to where the eyes are. But those ear tufts are also called plumicorns, which is Also a fun name, but a little bit harder to remember than ear tufts. But in general, they're a large owl about the size of a crow, and they are quite tall and slender. The long-eared owl is nocturnal. And this is an example of a nocturnal owl with yellow eyes, if you remember back to our sight conversation. They also have a prominent orange-ish facial disc and have a pattern of white, dark brown, and orange kind of all over. The male's who sounds kind of like a stereotypical owl call, but also is a little bit more breathier, kind of like blowing across a glass bottle. And they can repeat that 10 to 200 times. I won't talk about all the female calls for owls, as there are a number of them, usually to do with predators approaching the nest. But for the long-eared owl, the female's nest call is a high-pitched call that sounds somewhat like a bleating lamb. So I have just the male's call here, so I'll play that in just a second here. So the next owl we're going to talk about is quite a bit smaller, about robin sized, but also nocturnal and also with yellow eyes and ear tufts. And that is the eastern screech owl. Eastern screech owls have both gray and red morphs, but most of the owls in Manitoba that you would find would be the gray morph. If you're picturing the red morph, it looks basically the same, but with kind of a reddish sort of tinge to it. For the eastern screech owl, at night, they tend to perch on low limbs in open forest areas or edges, and basically they're scanning their prey to hunt, and you can find them in any type of treed habitat. They nest in old woodpecker holes and other tree cavities, and during the day you can find them sometimes roosting right next to the tree trunk. With their coloration, they are very camouflaged and can blend into bark quite well. If you're listening for the song of the eastern screech owl, it's an even pitched trill, and they use that to keep in contact with each other, and that's called a tremolo. And they also have a shorter, shrill, and descending whinny call that they're used to defend their territory. So I'll play the call now, and the recording I'm going to play has both the trill as well as the whinny. So listen for them both. So what you heard first was the whinny, and then you heard the trill. And next we are going to talk about the great horned owl. And this is one that is probably quite familiar to folks. The great horned owl is both crepuscular and nocturnal, so active at night as well as near dawn and dusk. It's quite a large owl, the biggest one we've talked about so far, about between the size of a crow and a goose. They have prominent ear tufts and also yellow eyes. The plumage of the great horned owl varies regionally from gray to a cinnamon color, kind of along the same lines as the screech owl. However, like the screech owl, most Manitoba great horned owls are gray toned. During the day, they tend to roost in secluded trees. They'll use both evergreen and deciduous forests. And they like treed areas for roosting, as well as mixed with open areas for hunting their prey. And you can also find great horned owls in cities, towns, suburbs, and parks. So they are a somewhat urban owl, or they can be a somewhat urban owl. Their song is quite a I guess typical owl hoot, but it sounds a bit like they're stuttering. And for the great horned owls, both the males and the females will duet, and the females are a bit higher pitched than the males. So I'll play it now. Unfortunately, I don't have the owls duetting, but it is, you can hear the stuttering rhythm of the hoots. So next, we've got the great gray owl, which is Manitoba's provincial bird. The great gray owl is mostly nocturnal. However, they can be diurnal and crepuscular. So an example of a bird that can be active at different times of the day and night. Like the great horned owl, they are quite large, between the size of a crow and a goose. You'll notice that this owl has a very rounded looking head, as it has no ear tufts. The great gray owl has yellow eyes, and overall they're a silver gray color. Unfortunately, it's not super clear in this picture because the owl's kind of looking over its back. But they do have a pattern of feathers on their neck that looks a little bit like a white bow tie, with the white areas sort of being the bow and the tie of the bow tie being a black center. So that can be useful if you're not just going off of sort of size and overall color. The great gray owl likes really dense areas of evergreen trees like pine and spruce, and you can also look for them in bogs and meadows. Great gray owls tend to hunt from perches, so they're going to sit somewhere and sort of scan around and look to see where they can find their prey. Once again, sort of a more typical hoot sound than some of the other more unique calls that we hear from owls. So we'll play that one now. So next we're going to move on to the barred owl. This is another medium-sized owl. Barred owls are nocturnal. Unlike a lot of the owls we've talked about with yellow eyes, the barred owl has dark eyes. You can also see a rounded head. There's no ear tufts, and they have a yellow bill. The front of the barred owl, which you can just barely see in this picture, is buffy with light streaks, and the back is mottled white and brown, and the tail is brown with white barring. The barred owl is also an owl that nests in tree cavities. They tend to live in large mature forests, and those forests can be either deciduous trees or evergreen trees or both. If you're familiar with birding, you may have heard of the mnemonics that people make up to help remember bird calls and bird songs. And for the barred owl, the way that people often use to remember it is who cooks for you all. So I'll play that now, and you can decide if that helps you remember what it sounds like or not. And now we're really going down in size for owls. Next, we have the northern saw-whet owl, which I have here is about robin-sized, and they are our smallest owl in Manitoba. They are nocturnal, and as you can tell by the very shocked-looking owl in the top picture here, they have yellow eyes. They also have a rounded head with no ear tufts, and they're mottled white and brown. The young saw-whet owls, which you can see in the bottom picture here, look quite a bit different than the adults. You can see a darker brown plumage on the head, as well as sort of a lighter reddish beige plumage on the breast. And whether they are young or adult plumage, You can see that they have a white V or Y between the eyes. It's much more obvious on the young ones, but the adults do have it too. So that can be a way to tell if the sort of size doesn't give it away. And it is quite deceiving. These guys, they're fluffy, but they are really small if you've ever seen them in person. In terms of the sound, they make a beeping sound, which to me sounds like a high-pitched, fast truck backing up sound. So I'll play it now for you. Last but not least, we have the boreal owl. Once again, a nocturnal owl with yellow eyes and no ear tufts. Of the owls that we've seen with no ear tufts in the past, I've mentioned that they have sort of a rounded head. The boreal owl has more of a square looking head, and part of this is sort of the way the facial disc or the outer edges of the facial disc are arranged, I think, gives them that square head or square looking head. Some people will say with the patterning of the facial disc, they also have an angry look, which I would think is quite subjective. But their back and head is brown with white spots, with the spots getting smaller on their head, while their breast and belly are streaky. And this is another small owl, a little bit bigger than the Saw-whet, but still quite small at around robin size. And like the great gray owl, the boreal owl is a sit and wait hunter. So they're sitting on a perch and scanning around looking for an opportunity to grab some prey. And as its name suggests, the boreal owl is generally in the boreal forest, but it can be a mix of trees, including spruce, aspen, poplar, birch, and pine, etc. Their song sounds a bit similar to a winnowing snipe. It's a series of 8 to 20 low whistled toots that get progressively louder as the song goes on. So we'll play that now. So I'm not going to have a full sort of where to see section broken down by important bird areas or otherwise, as these owls have different habitats where they can be found in, and generally you don't find clusters of them the way you might find for some other birds. Instead, I have some suggestions for you on what you can look for if you're looking for owls. If you're out during the day, you can look for whitewashed trees that indicate favored perches, where the owl spends a lot of time, and therefore the owl is using the bathroom. You can look in all areas of the trees. Some owls will be out near the tree tops. Some will be in near the tree trunk, and also look high and low. So for example, the saw-whet owl tends to perch quite low in the trees, usually at around eye height of a person. So not just the tree tops, also look a little bit lower. During the day, you can also look and listen for mobbing or alarm calls by other bird species. Because owls are birds of prey, other species, smaller species, things like blue jays and chickadees tend to not like having them around. So they'll try to drive them off by rushing at them or calling loudly. Of course, you can also listen for their calls starting at dusk for the crepuscular and nocturnal species. Interestingly, many owls actually vocalize at a low frequency, and this allows their songs to travel long distances without being absorbed by vegetation. So this can be helpful in that you can hear an owl from a distance away and try to find it, but it can also be unhelpful because just because you can hear an owl doesn't mean that it's close by in terms of trying to find it. And in terms of time of year, you're looking for more late winter, early spring is when the owls are going to be most active. And we're going to touch on one more group before we finish going through our nocturnal and crepuscular species, and that is the nightjars. There are 2 species of nightjars found in Manitoba, or commonly found in Manitoba, I should say. As you can see by the silhouette in the side, they're characterized by their long pointed wings, and they also have short beaks and short legs. You might hear them, or you might have heard them called goat suckers due to an old folk tale that they sucked milk from goats, and this is still the root of the Latin family name. So general adaptations for this group have to do with both their nocturnal lifestyle, but also they are aerial insectivores, meaning they are birds that catch insects while in flight. And so these adaptations sort of reflect both of these things. So as I mentioned, long, slender wings, they are very maneuverable and they have to be in order to catch insects. They also have a very short beak, but a wide mouth gape. And for the short beak, you can look at the photo under rictal bristles and see how small that beak is, but how wide they can open their mouths gives them a wide target for catching insects. Additionally, our species in Manitoba have something called rictal bristles. However, not all nightjar species have this. But rictal bristles look a bit like the whiskers of a cat, but they are actually simple feathers where only the central stem of the feather is left, so the feather doesn't have any of its sort of fluffy barbs. And rictal bristles can serve different functions depending on the species, including helping with tactile and touch sensations, helping with navigation, with foraging, collision avoidance, etc. And for insect-eating birds, rictal bristles might help funnel food into their mouths, keep feathers surrounding the mouths clean, and perhaps help in navigation around sort of densely forested areas. And nightjars are not the only species with rictal bristles. Some flycatchers, for example, also have them. And then also important for nightjars is excellent camouflage. Like other nocturnal species, they are out foraging during the night. So this means they have to be camouflaged while they're roosting during the day. So their patterning generally has them blending into bark or blending into leaves on the ground, as they are ground nesting birds. So the first one we have is the eastern whippoorwill, which is a species at risk in Manitoba and federally. It is a threatened species. They have a round head and a stout chest. Overall, they're mottled gray and brown with a line of gray feathers down the back. And if you happen to see one in flight, females will have a buffy colored tail corners while males have white tail corners. However, they are very camouflaged. So you're unlikely to see one during the day unless, for example, maybe you're able to catch one as it's flying into a new a roosting site. But generally, once they're settled, they are camouflaged very well to their surroundings. However, although you might not see them, if they are around, you probably have heard them. They do a lot of vocalizations, and they say their name, whippoorwill, and they repeat it many times. So I'll play it now. And they can do that for 30 minutes. They can do that upwards of an hour. So they can be a very vocal bird. And then the other common nightjar in Manitoba is the common nighthawk. You can see a very similar sort of body outline or silhouette when they are perched. Also mottled tan, brown, and black, and also very well camouflaged with tree bark or with leaves on the ground. However, one good difference to tell them apart from common nighthawk, or from, eastern whippoorwills, is that common nighthawks have white on the leading edge of their wing, and this is visible both while they're perched as well as while they're in flight. So in the top photo, while it's perched, if you look just below the sort of elbow joint of the wing, you can see the white patch. And from the bottom photo, you can see the white patch on the wing is quite obvious. The common nighthawk looks quite chunky while it's perched, but it looks very slender in flight. And you're more likely to see the common nighthawk in daylight than you are an eastern whippoorwill. In terms of sounds that they make, the call would be a peent or a beer sound is sort of the two words that people put towards the call. And I'll play that now. And then the other sound they make, which is not a vocalization, it's called the wing boom. And the wing boom is actually the sound of the wind moving through their feathers. So what they will do is they'll fly high, usually slightly above the treetop, and then make a dive to the ground. And as they are pulling out of the dive, they will flex their wings downward, and the air rushing over the feathers in this position makes the wing boom. And the wing boom sounds kind of like a car speeding by in the distance is what I think. So I'll play the wing boom now, and you'll hear the call first, and then you'll hear the rushing noise of the wing boom. So hopefully you heard that there. I'll try to play it again. So in terms of where to see these species, the common nighthawk is quite widely distributed across Manitoba. You can find them in most of the province, in boreal forest, in deciduous forest, mixed wood forests, etc. You can also see them over cities and towns. The common nighthawk, if you see a nightjar perched out on a fence out in the open, that would be more likely to be the common nighthawk. And you often find them nearby wetlands for foraging because they are insect-eating birds, like I mentioned, and a lot of insects have an aquatic larval stage. The eastern whippoorwill, their breeding habitat, it largely depends on forest structure. They like the forest to be a little bit open, so open mixed woods or deciduous forests. And you can also find them in forests that are open as they're regenerating following a disturbance like forest fire. And they tend to be more concentrated in the Interlake and eastern regions of Manitoba. So you can see them and or hear them in places like Delta Marsh IBA or the Northeast and West Shoal Lakes IBA, for example. And they also like to be nearby wetlands for foraging. And so the last, not really a species of bird, but sort of a group of birds that I thought I'd touch on is migrating land birds. And so these would be birds like your warblers, things like orioles, for example. And once they are on their breeding grounds, or if they're on their wintering grounds, they are generally active during the day and diurnal. But a lot of these birds actually migrate at night, and not many people know that. So there are multiple benefits for these birds to migrate at night. The first one being it's generally cooler at night, and migration takes a lot of energy and generates a lot of heat. And birds don't have a lot of areas of their body where they can release that heat. Usually it's through the legs. So migrating at a time when it's cooler is really beneficial. Additionally, air is generally more stable at night. You may have heard of larger soaring birds taking advantage of thermals to reduce the energetic expense of migration. However, thermals caused by the uneven heating of the Earth's surface during the day is actually not so beneficial to birds that are less strong flyers. So they are really looking for the stable air. Additionally, it helps to avoid daytime predators to migrate at night, and it's easier to find food during the day, so they might as well travel at night. That way they can forage during the day. So I have an example of night migration of songbirds here. This is a website called Birdcast that uses weather radar to predict bird migration and to show bird migration. So large areas of birds do show up on weather radar, and so you can track that. So this is going to be a heat map where high concentrations of birds are in the yellow-white side and low concentration of birds are in the purple-pink side. So right now it's set at 6:30 in the evening, and you're going to see the colors move as the bird moves, but you're also going to see a red line come across, and that's going to denote sunset. So right after that red line crosses, look to see how the bird concentrations change. And then after we run through night, you're going to see a yellow line come by and look to see what happens with the bird concentrations after that. So other ways that people can observe and study these birds that are migrating at night is through you can do the old-fashioned way of looking up at the moon to see the silhouettes of the birds coming by through a spotting scope or with binoculars. But a lot of this is done acoustically by listening to the birds' flight calls, which are generally little chirps or little peeps. And people have DIY'd these acoustic microphones out of things like flower pots, and you can get these kits. Or people use parabolic dishes and microphones as well to track this. And when I do a presentation, I always try to end with a little bit of what you can do or what you can help with for these birds. We've looked at a really diverse group of birds today. So there's no sort of one solution or one thing to do to help sort of them all. If you were at our program 2 weeks ago with the red-headed woodpeckers, the other bird species that was on that sign for the conservation champions was actually an eastern whippoorwill. So we are working to do outreach with community groups, classrooms, and landowners for this bird species as well. We do also conduct nighttime monitoring for eastern whippoorwill, and we also pick up common nighthawk. So if you're interested in that, you can give me an email at iba@naturemanitoba.ca. We're always looking for volunteers. It's a bit of a difference than birding during the day, so it can be quite interesting. And we are working with landowners if they're interested in signing non-binding conservation agreements if they have eastern whippoorwill on their land. But beyond that, in terms of our other birds, we can also advocate for less pesticide use. For example, nightjars, like I mentioned, are insect-eating birds, and also advocate for the preservation of wetlands. So a lot of times wetlands are sort of less valued lands, but we know that they're important for a number of species, not only to provide insect prey for our nightjars, but also as habitat for the yellow rail, which is a species at risk, as well as for species like the great blue heron or like the black-crowned night heron. Another thing you can do, and this is largely related to owls, because they are such a charismatic species, they can attract a lot of attention when owls are found by other bird watchers, by bird photographers, the general public. So it's important to be respectful of these species when we do come across them and try not to disturb them too much. And like I mentioned, in terms of other migrating birds, they are migrating at night, and light can disrupt that migration process. So when you hear about turning lights out for migratory birds, that's something really easy that we can do to help a whole group of birds that are using habitat at night. So that is the end of my presentation here today. And thank you so much for joining us. And if anybody has questions, I'll be happy to take them. You can type them in the chat bar, or if you want to unmute yourself, you are welcome to do that as well.
Amanda?
Yeah.
When you were talking about the yellow rail, you mentioned a couple of places that they can be heard, the Proven Lake and
Douglas Marsh. Yep.
No, you didn't mention around Ross and down in that area. Is that because you mentioned because there's no IBA in that area?
Yeah, so I was focusing largely on where you can see them with IBAs.
Yeah, okay.
But you can find them in different parts of the province. Douglas Marsh in particular was because that's what the IBA was designated for.
Right.
So that was an important one. And Proven Lake, people have heard them relatively recently in the last few years. So I just know that they're actively there. But by no means those are the only places in the province where you can find yellow rails. Yeah.
Thank you.
Gorda's asking, can we hear the calls again? I won't go through everything here again, but I will be putting the presentation up on YouTube, the same place on our Manitoba IBA YouTube channel where all of our other recordings are. And I'll send out that link to everybody once I have it up. It'll be a couple of days. But actually a great place to go for bird calls is a website called Xenocanto. And I'll put it in the chat here because it's not necessarily spelt the way you think. I believe it's xenocanto.org. And it's basically just bird calls. You can see maps, you can see subspecies, they'll have calls, they'll have songs, they'll have other sounds like wing booms. And it's great for bird audio. Another site for bird audio would be if you go to Cornell Labs All About Bird sites, they'll have their sort of normal bird ID section, but they'll also have a section for sounds and calls. And there they give a bit more of a description in words as well as to what the call will sound like or what people might the words people associate with a call, if that helps you remember. So those are two really good resources for bird calls and songs. As well, both of them have a wider variety of the different noises these birds can make. So if you hear a mystery sound at night and you want to go hunting to see if you can find it, if it is a bird, between those two websites should give you a pretty good overview of all the different kinds of noises that the nocturnal or crepuscular birds can make. So I see we're at just a few minutes to 8. So I'll stick around if anybody is still thinking of questions. But I also just wanted to let people know that we have one last webinar in our webinar series, and it is next week. We'll be looking at shorebirds of Manitoba. Same day, same time, Wednesday, May 11th at 7 p.m. And that will be with Dr. Christian Artuso to give us that sort of outline about shorebirds as well as the many species we can find in our province.